Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. Most people seem to think that they can be indifferent to Jesus, but 1 Samuel 18 suggests you can't have a foot in both camps, not with a king. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Well, I'm not really bothered either way. That's actually what many people seem to think about Jesus. They're happy enough for us to take it seriously, but they don't want to take a firm position themselves. Maybe they want to have a foot in both camps. It seems to be the comfortable option. Not committed, but not also opposed. Not convinced, but also not rejecting. And it sounds very reasonable. It sounds even admirably careful. But Jesus says you just can't do it. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, Jesus says, "Whoever is not with me is against me." And in Mark chapter 9, verse 40, in a different situation, he says it the other way around. The one who is not against us is for us. In other words, a person is never just undecided about Jesus. To not stand with him is to stand against him. Why? Well, because of who he is, compared to you and to me and to all people and even to all creation. Now, through our study of 1 Samuel, we have been learning what it means to call Jesus Christ. Christ is not a surname. It's not a religious label. It's a title with deep significance that is drawn from the Old Testament. Just like the Old Testament defines the proper meaning of words like redemption and covenant and blessing and inheritance, the Old Testament also gives the background to this word, Christ. It means anointed one. It means God's chosen king. In 1 Samuel, God's anointed king is David, king of God's chosen people, Israel. And in David, God reveals the core meaning of the title Christ. So when we call Jesus Christ, we are saying that he fulfills everything that David was pointing towards. David was the Lord's anointed, but Jesus is the true and final anointed one, the king who would not fail. And this, friends, is why there can never be a neutral position regarding Jesus, the Christ. The response to God's king is something that divides people. In David's day, some recognized God's choice, and they responded to David with love and with loyalty, just like we saw last time, if you look back to 18 verse 4, as Jonathan gave up to David his royal robe. And in verses 5 to 7, the army and the officers and all the people rejoiced in David as their new champion. But we also saw another response, the response of Saul, who feared David, verse 12. And that fear is the dominant note about the relationship between Saul and David from this point in 1 Samuel onwards. Saul's suspicion will harden into hatred, and his hostility will grow increasingly desperate. It began with what seemed like a sensible appointment. David was placed in chapter 18, verse 5, over the men of war. But then Saul started hearing the songs the people were singing back in chapter 18, verse 8. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me only thousands. And jealousy takes root in Saul as we read the next verse. And Saul eyed David from that day on. And in verse 11, he hurled his spear at David, trying to pin David to the wall. The facade of neutrality toward David is left far behind. And so we return to the question, why is it impossible to be neutral toward Jesus Christ? because when God places his king on the throne, we must respond in one way or another. To ignore him, to delay, to withhold our allegiance, those are not neutral acts. They are refusal to taking the king's authority. And with that in mind, we turn to verses 17 to 30 of 1 Samuel 18. First, a failed plot in verses 17 to 19. And we discover that steadiness and predictability are not Saul's core competencies at this time. If you remember back to verse 13, Saul has removed David from his presence out of fear, and now, only a couple of verses later, he's speaking to David again, and this time with an offer that sounds generous, even royal. Verse 17, here's my elder daughter Merab. I'll give her to you for a wife. That's quite strange behaviour for a man who's afraid of this rival. What's going on? Well, on the surface, it looks like Saul is fulfilling a promise. You might remember back as the Israelite army were facing Goliath of Gath, a rumour had been going around that the man who killed Goliath would receive the king's daughter in marriage. Maybe here Saul is just keeping his promise, except that there's no hint that this is a reward. In verse 17, there's not reward, only conditions. Only be valiant for me, says Paul, and fight the Lord's battles. Again, that might sound a reasonable expectation for a future royal son-in-law. Prove your worth, earn your place. But the reality is, it's a trap. And the narrator lets us in on Saul's true thoughts in the last section of verse 17. Do you see it there? Let not my hand, says Saul, be against him, David, but let the hands of the Philistines be against him. You see, Saul didn't want David as a son-in-law. What he wants is David dead. But the problem is David has public approval, so a direct attack on him might backfire. And so Saul is setting up a devious and subtle scheme. He will send David into dangerous military campaigns, dressed up as royal service, hoping that the Philistines will solve his problem for him. This may even explain what we heard back in verse 13, that David was made a commander of 1,000. Saul is putting David directly into harm's way. But friends, just step back and see what Saul is doing in order to achieve his objective. For Saul's plan to succeed, it requires a victory by the Philistines over Israel. Saul, the one who's supposed to be the king of Israel, the one who's supposed to be fighting battles against God's enemies, is actually going about planning a defeat of God's people. Not only that, but can you also see that Saul's plan is an enemy victory that will get rid of God's chosen one? Saul is, by doing this, setting himself against God's own plan. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that Saul's plan fails. Verse 18, David responds with extraordinary humility. Who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? Now, we're not told if this is a refusal or a delay, but we are told that the marriage doesn't happen. Instead, we are told in verse 19, Merab, Saul's daughter, was given to Adriel from that place that I can't pronounce, whether it's Mehethalite, for a wife. Saul either withdrew the offer or he never meant it to begin with. But there's an irony in David's words if we look at them again. We who know what is really happening, because we know David is the Lord's anointed one, you notice his words, who am I? They are an echo of the words that Saul had uttered himself when he had first been called by God back in chapter 9. Saul had said, am I not a Bethlehemite from the least of the tribes of Israel? The roles have reversed. David, the true king, speaks with humility, while the rejected one schemes in powerful fear. So Saul's plan collapses. David's still alive. David is still in the public eye, still growing in favour, and Saul's fears remain unresolved. His plot has failed. In verses 20 to 27, we find that some time has passed. Saul's first plot to eliminate David has failed, but a fresh opportunity presents itself, and scheming Saul seizes it. Verses 20 to 25 is the second opportunity. The opening doesn't come from Saul, but it actually comes from his younger daughter. Now, Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. In verse 1, we'd heard that Saul's son Jonathan loved David, and now and then in verse 16 we heard that all Israel and Judah loved David, and now we hear that Saul's son Michal loves David too. I guess we can understand how unnerving this is for King Saul. The people's affection for David is getting deeper and it's getting wider. David is not just admired, he's adored. But Michal's love introduces something new, romantic love. But just like Jonathan's loyalty and the people's joy, there's more going on. There's more at stake in this, because Michal's love of David aligns her with all who are responding to David as the Lord's anointed one. And when Saul hears the report, we might have expected outrage. But look at verse 20, the second part of it. We're told the thing pleased him. Literally, it says, it was right in his eyes. And you might wonder, has Saul changed his tune? No. Look at why Saul thought that this was a good thing. Verse 21. Let me give her to him, that she might be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Saul hasn't changed. He's just glad that he can reactivate his earlier plan, but this time with a slightly new angle. Having failed with his elder daughter, he now offers his younger daughter, repeating the proposal. 21, you shall now be my son-in-law. Now, we're not told whether David declined the first offer or whether Saul had withdrawn it, but this time Saul puts a bit more effort in to persuade David. He sends servants with a flattering message in verse 22. Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. David's reply is as humble as it was before, but this time we get a bit more specific detail about what his concern is about this arrangement in verse 23. Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I'm a poor man and have no reputation? Now, this is not just humility. There's something very practical here, because royal marriages are expensive. The groom and his family were to pay a bride price, a compensation and surety of the bond between the two families. But David is not from a high and wealthy family, certainly not the level of a worldly royalty like Saul's family. But Saul sees his opportunity. If money is the problem, then let's set a price that David can afford, one that he's going to leap at, one that will allow Saul his opportunity against David to kill him. Verse 25, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he might be avenged of the king's enemies. Perhaps here there is a little play on the young David's words when he was in the camp of Israel, as Israel was quaking under Goliath's threats. Do you remember what David had said back then in 1 Samuel 6:17, verse 26? He said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Maybe Saul is saying, all very well to be lucky with one stone. Let's see how this upstart handles more than one of these uncircumcised enemies he was taunting. But Saul's real motive we get from the narrator in verse 25. Do you see it there? Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Saul intends this to be a death sentence in disguise. It'd be ludicrous for David to survive something like this, and it would happen before any wedding happened either. But in verses 26 to 27, things happen differently to how Saul intends. David, the Lord's anointed, is very good at achieving ludicrous successes. Verse 26, when his servants told David these words, it pleased David. It pleased him well to be the king's son-in-law. That phrase, it pleased David well, uses that vision language. It was right in David's eyes. The same language as Saul's words a couple of verses ago when he heard about Michal's love for David and he came up with the plot. But which eyes are seeing things rightly? David's eyes or Saul's eyes? The one who sees murder by proxy, or the one who sees a chance to win a wife who loves him? This deadly deal bizarrely seems right in David's eyes. David hears the terms and he accepts them. Do you see the contrast between David and Saul? Saul schemes a trap to catch David with flattery and with danger. David responds with courage and resolve. And before the deadline passes, David acts halfway through chapter 18, verse 26. David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. Not 100, 200. Double the price, double the risk, and the mission is a complete success. 27, the second half, David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul's plot has failed again. In fact, what's happened is the absolute opposite of everything that Saul had intended. Can you imagine Saul's face as the report is brought in that David has done it, that he has double done it, and that Saul has to keep his word? And so in verse 27 we read that Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. Saul's plan to destroy David has backfired, elevating David further. The Lord's anointed is now part of the royal family by marriage that Saul himself has arranged. Now, earlier in the chapter, Jonathan, you'll remember, the crown prince, he had given David his robe, his armour, his allegiance. It was as if Jonathan adopted David as his elder brother, and older brothers have a higher claim to the throne. And now, by marriage to Michal, David becomes Saul's son-in-law, publicly, legally, conclusively. Saul had plotted, but the success was not his, it was David. Actually, more than that, friends. Success is the Lord's. For the Lord's anointed could not be undone by the schemes of a fearful king. Every attempt to bring David down only lifts him higher. Now, this is a pattern that might be making you think of something else, of someone else. Do you remember another time in history when a king called Herod was afraid when he heard of the birth of another who was being called king, and he sought to kill that child? And then leader after leader seeks to bring this rival down, but all of their schemes only succeed in lifting him high. Even the most obvious and apparent defeat was actually the greatest glory of the Christ. We'll come back again to verse 28 in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Saul's second schemes failed, but it's not just failed. He has unintentionally elevated David. David lives, he's married to the king's daughter, and he's returned from another unlikely victory in battle, gaining even greater honour, continuing to defeat the enemies of God's people like God's chosen king should. Any negative effects in this story are falling on Saul, not on David, verse 28. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. that contains the phrase that resounds through this chapter, "The Lord was with David." That is something we know because the narrator has told us that this is the case. In verse 15, Saul has been unsettled to see David's success. In verse 12, he had been fearful of David, but now Saul sees and knows this unsettling success is because the Lord is with David. And that changes everything. And David is joined now to Saul's own family, and the Lord's presence is undeniable in it. And so what does that lead Saul to be? Even more afraid. Saul has no control over the rising star in his court. His daughter's love for David, once useful as bait, has now become one more reason for fear. And the result is sobering. Verse 29, "So Saul was David's enemy continually." This is not mere incidental opposition. Saul has a settled attitude of hostility and hatred toward David. Saul has chosen his stance. But if David is the Lord's anointed, do you see what Saul is doing is setting himself against the Lord's purposes? The chapter ends with a glimpse of what lies ahead in verse 30. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. David continues to rise, just like the righteous man described in Psalm chapter 1. In all that he does, he prospers. And do you see, dear friends, there is no way Saul could be neutral toward God's anointed king. When it comes to the Lord's anointed, when it comes to the Christ, there is no possibility of neutrality. Not for Saul, not for Israel, and not for us, and not for our colleagues or our friends or our family. If the Lord is with his anointed, and if you are not with the anointed, then you are against him, and you are against God himself. Jonathan loved David and gave him his robe. He's all in with the Christ. Saul feared, and that turned to hate, seeking to kill the Lord's Christ. Do you see that this account points beyond itself to Jesus, to David's descendant, who is the great Christ, the King of all, who is the Lord himself? And it is not possible to be neutral about Jesus. You are either for him or you are against him. And all who set themselves against him to try and make him fail, to dishonour him, or to destroy him, or even try and be ambivalent toward him, are working against the Lord himself. They are making him his enemies. And every time, of course, they try to put him down or make him fail, what they're actually doing is lifting him higher and higher. And don't we remember what happened is described in Philippians 2, verses 9 to 11. Through the most shameful of deaths, we read, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed upon him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. He is the Lord's Christ. And still today, it is not possible to remain neutral toward him. You are either for him or you are against him. Your colleagues are either for him or they are against him. John chapter 3, verse 36. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, for the wrath of God remains on him. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.